Hi, Jasmyn.
Hi, Tooba.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the podcast series that we're doing. We are working the Safe Space and Sukhan together to create a podcast series that basically centers on human relationships, and we're interviewing, different mental health counselors and getting to do sort of deep dives into different kinds of relationships and how they affect our lives. And for a lot of the episodes, we've been sort of exploring how relationships between family, between partners, or how conflict, might show up. But we've sort of been looking at just how the people in the relationship are working with each other, right? And what you and I were really interested to explore was how a relationship isn't just sort of self-contained, it's also affected by the context in which it's in, whether that's a family context, the culture in which it's placed, and also maybe some cultural moments that are happening also kind of impact what's going on in our person-to-person relationships with each other.
Yeah. Firstly, I love this initiative of the podcast. I think it's brilliant, so needed. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for having me. So about human relationships, I think sometimes as therapists, not sometimes, but often, so much of our work is about the intricacies between two people. And so often we kind of step away from the macro, which is the top-down effect, which is the environment. And there are huge traumas that actually happen in our environment that have the ability to shape society. So without being political, like even countries' identities have been born out of massive traumatic events, cultural identities, cultural aspects, nationalism. And, I'm not going to reference all of that, but that is the extent to how powerful traumatic events are that take place. And if we just think about it, just recent, like it feels like this year or two of COVID, it's been such a blur, right? But just off the top of my head, I mean, the huge things that we've shared collectively, like COVID, we've been through globally. What we've been seeing happening with Earth March in this country year after year, gearing up, getting stronger. The Me Too movement globally and in this country. Black Lives Matter, Palestine, the whole world kind of standing up and shifting their stance. So I think such powerful things happen, and we tend to, in a way, disassociate the kind of impact that they have on our individual lives, but they really can shape what is going on inside us, and in terms of how we feel, in terms of how we relate, in terms of how we identify. And then this most recent, horrific episode that we've been through here in Islamabad with the murder case in August. I haven't seen Tooba in the same city such an intense traumatic impact at the same time. In my early, minimal career, I haven't seen that. It was so intense. And one of the most interesting things for me was I felt like therapists were traumatized working with traumatized clients. Yeah. And for the first time, I could see that there was a whole group of traumatized therapists, because therapists were really up close this time.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of degrees of separation from what happened.
Yeah, we didn't. I think there was a lot of talk about therapy going on, qualifications, organizations. So regardless of what your situation was as a therapist, you were definitely up close and tuned in to what was happening. And I was speaking with multiple therapists, including myself, who felt traumatized in this process. And then working with all kinds of trauma that was coming in. And I can tell you that it's lingered on and on and on. And there was almost no one from any specific demographic who did not come in and talk about this case. So, and I suppose that it makes you wonder, how does this happen sometimes that we struggle with femicide here all the time. It's horrific. It's heinous. The numbers are off the charts. But sometimes there's a culmination of events, like something building up that reaches a certain point. We saw this with George Floyd as well. It's not like it wasn't happening before. It's not like women aren't killed in this country all the time, every day by men. But it gets to this, I want to say, melting point, and it kind of explodes and turns into a collective trauma, and it becomes a highly symbolic event.
Right. Yeah.
What I saw, with this was, there's so many layers to this. There's so many layers. So I'm trying to think where to start. But what I will say is, when we have this symbolic event, one of the first things we need to recognize is it's traumatic. Okay, so it's trauma. The memory of it, and by memory, I just mean the knowledge of it. It kind of extends beyond the event. So it stays with us and it has an impact on us and on society. And then if we really break it down, what I was seeing in my therapy, so with people I work with, is I think we carry fragments of the collective trauma that are completely different. Because I can tell you that almost everyone was traumatized from this collective kind of, impact. But fragments were so different. They were so opposing. So I work with a lot of couples, and no exaggeration, like I had couples coming in very completely unconsciously identifying with the masculine and the feminine, and having conflict over things that were not even really relevant in their marriage, and raising points, women being very angry at their husbands, women being very angry at their boyfriends, men feeling defensive, many men being feminists and, as wonderful as they are, but, when you're under attack in the therapy room, but just identifying with different parts of it. And I would say, before I go through all the layers, one of the biggest things that I saw that we all know is women are so angry for not being given basic human rights. So in this country, I don't even feel like calling it feminism, because I feel like it gets so convoluted. I'm a hardcore feminist, but I just want to say it's not feminism, it's human rights. It's just basic human rights. And there's just so much pent up trauma from generations and generations. So this is the macro, I think, that comes in, that we carry from our ancestors and our nannies and daddies and whoever, of women just feeling afraid of men, of feeling afraid of consequence, of feeling afraid of their own liberation, of feeling afraid of using their own voice, of feeling afraid of speaking up against violations. And I just think this was one of those symbolic moments that it just hit home so hard I'm going to say for all of us, for most of us. I'm speaking for myself, and I'm speaking for many people who I've spoken to.
Yeah.
I
just think that even in everything that you've shared, there's so many layers, like you said, to go into. So and I guess even starting just with that idea that for a long time mental health was thought of as something very individual, that it was contained inside the individual. And, if you were having a problem, it was because you were thinking in a certain way, or you just needed tools to manage your emotions. And it actually is sort of, with the rise of these more systemic, more feminist, also more sort of women centered lenses on psychology and on people's experience, that we've really now come to recognize that the personal and political cannot be separated. What is happening in your environment, what kind of laws exist, what public safety looks like, what can I wear safely and what can I not wear safely. All of that has a significant impact on our individual mental health and on our relational well-being. Like you can't separate those two. You can't have a sick society and then expect people to be well adjusted in it.
Absolutely. I mean, I would liken this to when we're working sometimes with people who are in very difficult, abusive situations, and therapist is trying to do the work, but we can't. I mean, because the environment is sick, it's unhealthy, it's abusive. Yeah. And so I think the same way, exactly what you're saying, just the whole systemic thing from the top. When society is unwell, when society is traumatized, there's no way that we can disconnect ourselves from that. But I love that you just brought in this mental health thing also, because that was another thought that I had during this time, during August. So firstly, this is a huge moment for women to stand up for themselves, to stand up for ourselves, to stand up for the way like we feel in public spaces, the way I feel in public spaces, the way my ancestors felt. And that's one part of it. It's so relevant, maybe the most critical. I think this is a huge mental health potential moment as well, because we are in such big denial about mental health in this country, where we're like, oh, no, he's okay and they're okay and they don't need help and they don't need diagnosis and they don't need medication. And that's not even my area. As you know, like I'm a counseling psychologist, but I think just recognizing and accepting and creating systems that are more supportive of severe mental health issues is so critical. And I think for me, that is one of the things that came up. And I understand that's a controversial point because we don't know, the case is not resolved. I'm not making any assumptions. I just feel like you have to be very unwell for something like that to happen, in whichever capacity or whatever lens you might look at it from. So there was also that for me.
Yeah. One of the things that, as you said, that we were not aware of the specifics of this case, but something that you and I have probably heard a lot as therapists is there's one person who's a client who comes to work with us, right? And then sometimes what you can identify is that their distress and their trauma has actually come from a family member who very evidently has some severe mental health issue that should have been addressed. Yeah. That with proper care, medication, and therapy, could have been a well-adjusted individual. Because you and I also work with people with, as you said, we're counseling on the counseling side, so we tend to work with sort of mild to moderate mental illnesses when it comes to that. But we do work with people with mental illnesses who are well-adjusted, who are, going to the doctor, coming to therapy, learning the tools that they need to survive. And we also work with a lot of survivors of trauma where we can see that, somebody in the family had an unidentified or untreated or just sort of in denial about a personality disposition that can be very unhealthy, a mental health issue that should have been diagnosed and treated. And I think a really, really scary part of that denial for me, not only as a therapist, for my clients, it brings up a lot of anger and outrage in me. As a person and a woman, it scares me that families will actively conceal issues about other family members and fully being aware that there is some toxic tendency, marry them to people.
Absolutely. I mean, this is so not uncommon, as we know. Mm-hmm. And when you say that, I mean, what really comes to mind, other than the fact that this huge violation going on, it's shame. It's a shame-based culture that we live in. It's shame when it comes to women speaking up about their abuse. There's shame when it comes to saying that someone is mentally struggling or they have a mental health issue. There's so much shame in our larger systemic systems that perpetuate these issues. And so when this case happened, I mean, I think part of what I saw shatter was there was enough anger and rage from women to move past that shame and to say, hey, you know what? Me too. I felt unsafe. I've been hit by my boyfriend. and then I think with mental health, like I was hoping we could see more of it, or that we can keep seeing more of it in different ways, where we can start as a culture moving past the shame, that there is no shame in it, know? And I know that that's easy for us to sit here and say that, but we actually don't have systems that nurture this. So I think when these big symbolic, traumatic events happen, they really challenge the systems. So it stops being about so and so and so and so, and it starts being about men and women and mental health. And it stops being about prisons and who's getting privilege in a prison. And it starts being about the systems in the prison. And it starts being about, elitist, the elite and all the talk that we've had. And I think somewhere, I think we get sucked into thinking, because it's traumatic. So when it's traumatic, we're triggered. It's personal. So it's happening on this larger scale, but it doesn't mean it's not personal. It doesn't mean I'm not feeling it. It doesn't mean it's not doing something to me. So sometimes we get sucked into targeting individuals and losing sight of how this is such an important systemic moment. This is not about one person. This is about the whole system. This is us really trying to have a revolution against certain parts of our system that isn't working. And I would love to see more energy channeled there. That's how I was feeling through August, in terms of general rhetoric that was happening in the public. But I also want to address how it is so personal and how it does affect us in so many layers. And one of the ways I can kind of walk you through what I saw is through a lot of my work, is we tend to oversimplify trauma because we need to cope. So in the way that I'm processing it, there are a few events, and then, I've broken it down, and we don't always experience or feel or see all the fragments of it. So, which is healthy and normal, and that's part of how we cope. But I would say for me, when a collective trauma happens, I think it just kind of disperses. Like if you just imagine something shattering, and there are little pieces everywhere. And that's exactly what I saw with my work. I saw women who've been violated, who were angry, and everything we just spoke about. I saw people coming in with fear of mental illness. They have someone mentally unstable in their home, or they've been raised by someone, or they've just developed a fear because of that, because they've been raised with someone who was unwell, untreated. I saw people feeling afraid of themselves. So I saw people really resonating with the dark side of human nature, of what can happen, and bringing that in. I saw mothers coming in with just really young children, like just kids who might be struggling a little bit with behavior, having fears that it could be their son. So I saw people really deeply, unconsciously resonating with the parents of the accused murderer, unconsciously, by just being so afraid. Like, what if we messed up? How do we do this? How do we do this better? How do we do this right? I saw people who've lost children who were resonating with the girl who we lost, Noor, and what her parents must be going through. I saw men and women feeling afraid of their own anger, and I can just honestly say that if I look at it collectively as a whole, the empathy runs so deep that there wasn't one aspect of this event where some human didn't connect with.
Right.
So for me, it might have been one part, and for you, it might have been one part. But collectively, when I look at it together, there was no one part. It was from, I won't get into the details of the case, but like from the guards and the drivers and the friends, and just something that stirred something personal inside everyone. And I think it was a deep, a huge, for me, it was overwhelming, the kind of empathy, just in terms of how people processed it and how the trauma was traveling through everyone and how it was shifting things in their own personal life. I don't think it just ends with resonance and empathy. It actually, the magnitude of what happens in the environment, it shifts us into being different, processing differently, interacting differently, thinking differently, which can be hugely transformational as well when we have these collective traumas.
Yeah, which is, I think that's sort of also defining of a traumatic event, right? That there's a feeling of a before and an after. It doesn't sort of integrate neatly into the narrative of your life. It shifts, or I think fragment is quite the right word, because sometimes there is this sense of something sort of cracking. And then there was life as we knew before and life as we knew after. I think I sort of witnessed it, as you said, its sort of power and how deeply it impacted people in and sort of those often symptoms that you would see show up in individual clients after a personal traumatic event also showed up for people, right? Like, I know for me and for a lot of women in my life who I talked to, we all sort of said that it was hard to sleep. We all were, as you said at the beginning, there was these little conflicts coming up in our relationship with the men in our lives that weren't really about anything that was happening in the moment, but it was this, for myself and for some of my peers, my friends who I spoke to. Sometimes it was a challenge. Like, I'm going to push you, and I'm going to see, are you this person who I'm afraid you are? Sometimes it was, you're the sort of poster that I have for this system that you are a part of. And so you're the one who has to receive my anger, and you're the one who has to hold it. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was guardedness that, maybe I should dress differently when I go out. Maybe I should be more careful, with whose house I go to. And that, I think the last one was the one that was actually really heartbreaking for me. That it was very much, it was like it was pushing people collectively into this, this sort of fight and flight response, which is what happens when we individually experience trauma, right? That our creative centers, our playfulness, our exploration, our risk-taking, that gets shut down, and safety and predictability is you just kind of focus on that.
Absolutely. Like, I can completely resonate with everything that you said. And I can definitely say that I myself wasn't sleeping in that week, and I was speaking to a lot of people in our situation, and it got me really thinking systemically also about the macro, is that there's a huge trauma, and then we have a layer of traumatized people working with other traumatized people. And there's no way around it, actually, because it is a collective. There's no way to bring in non-traumatized therapists and place them there and heal the trauma.
Yeah.
Actually, no, we're all in this together. It is a systemic thing. And you can't remove yourself from that to process the trauma.
Right.
You have to be a part of it. So,
and that maybe in that moment that was, sort of the only way that we could heal, and sort of being vulnerable and being human and just coming together and being like, yeah, we're all overwhelmed. And another aspect that I do want to sort of touch on is that in the same way that, it ruptured gender relationships, I feel like there was also a rupture in therapeutic relationships. People went to their therapists feeling different, feeling distrustful, feeling scared.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, this is also what I meant when I said that regardless of which therapist you are, how you practice or where you trained from, for every therapist, I think this crept into the room because of the nature of the case, where the accused murderer was practicing to some degree as a therapist or training or whatever the details are. And I think that the reason this impacted people so much is that is your most sacred, safe space.
Yeah. And
to hear about such a safe space violated in the most inhumane way, I think it was just too horrific and too much to process right away.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people came in with, I know people terminated therapists. I know people came in with questions about it. I know people asked about safety. They asked about qualifications, just anything to say, hey, I mean, I'm feeling so unsafe in this space. I need to intellectualize it in order to just try to ground myself.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big thing. Unfortunately, because I think we've worked so hard over the last decade to create more openness around the idea of mental health concerns, around concepts of therapy, around recognition of therapy, around removing the shame. And I feel like within pockets, the progress has been enormous in terms of shifting perspective. But I think that there's also it's happened so rapidly that there's also a resistance, a very real resistance to therapy in this country. And I think when we had that traumatic event and that collapse of that safe space, that how safe you should feel with your therapist, the resistance that already existed in the system, it really shot up.
Yeah.
And I think because some of the acceptance of therapy had been growing so rapidly, the resistance had kind of been ignored for a while. And I know I'm speaking, I'm not speaking across the board, and I'm not speaking at every layer, but I think just generally mental health is on the rise. It's not limited to any SCS or cultural background. Companies, schools, organizations, everyone is incorporating it. It's happened so rapidly that as soon as that suspicion came in, that fear, the trauma of what that could be like, the resistance shot up sky high. And I saw a lot of therapists being torn down, And I'm not talking about therapists linked to specific organizations. I just mean in general, because there was so much mistrust that everyone was so suspicious. And I think therapists, like we all had to do our work, was in that time to rebuild safety again, which is a part of trauma work, as we know. But again, it was the macro taking away from this very intimate, safe place that we have with our client.
Yeah, and I think that like relationships, like intimate relationships, because therapy is also an intimate relationship. And as you said, that we already have the sort of existing stigma and shame around seeking therapy or needing therapy. And But on top of that, it's just this very real um, human fear of being vulnerable, right? Because when you go to therapy and basically somebody who you've never met starts asking you very, very personal questions right off the bat. And your therapist is not your friend, right? So while your therapist is open and to a large extent their authentic self with you, it's also a one-way relationship. So when I go to my therapist, there's a there's a very vulnerable trust that I extend to them. And I say, hey, I'm gonna be myself with you, even though I don't know a lot about you and will not know a lot about you. And I'm going to trust this relationship to be safe. And that's to me, and I think for us, it's a sacred sort of space that we try to create.
Absolutely. So it's perhaps the most vulnerable space, more so than an intimate relationship, because of what you just said, because I will bare my soul to you, knowing that I might not ever know too much about yours.
Yeah.
So we completely give in to everything that we imagine is equitable in this world, and everything that we imagine is balanced and equal. When we say, hey, I'm here to show up, I think it really does take a lot to build safety. And safety was really, really shaken up for all therapists and all clients in all therapy rooms all over the country, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we continue to sort of talk about the different pieces of this, I feel like we've touched on this briefly, which is that how do we then respond to something traumatic happening, right? Like in the same way that anger showed up in our personal relationships there. And now, especially sort of with the rise of social media and that complex relationship where the reason why this particular story was highlighted so much was because of social media. And there is a very real activism that takes place on that platform. I think of this brilliant movement that students led during the pandemic last year, where they called out, educational institutions and teachers and power imbalances, and largely through social media. So there is a real equalizing power that can be leveraged, and at the same time, it can also become very chaotic. It's sort of like it's hard to sort of figure out what exactly is it that I want. Yeah?
Absolutely. This is so complex. I've had some really difficult feelings about this myself, because just what you're saying, it's such a brilliant tool to raise your voice. And we all deserve to raise our voices. Just what you're saying, what the students did, it was, inspiring, brave, vulnerable, transformational, with what happened last year. Absolutely. I'm in awe of that. And so I think just having a platform where anyone can be heard is so important. And at the same time, I think when we take justice into our own hands, which is also what social media in some capacities allows us to do in terms of rhetoric, is that it can be very limiting, and it can be ostracizing, and it can actually have the opposite impact. So and what I'm referring to here is movements like cancel culture. And by in no way, I mean, just as a disclaimer, do I not stand with raising your voice against any of these atrocities, against any violations. I'm 100% for that. I just think that sometimes when there's the way that it happens, the way that we take our anger forward, and it needs to happen sometimes when we're going through a revolution, an emotional one, a systemic one, a cultural one, it's bloody. And I think it starts off that way. And that's how we shake the system up. But I think, and so I understand why it's happened in so many ways, but I think this "you're cancelled" is so limiting. It actually takes away accountability. So,
Well, actually, I would love it if you could say a little bit more about that. So maybe how we can differentiate, as you said, having that moment of responding with anger, and when it crosses over into cancel culture, and then if you could elaborate how cancel culture can work against accountability sometimes.
yeah. So if we really simplify it and we think about it in terms of blame.
Mm.
Now, Tooba, I can blame you for not editing this podcast well. Okay, so I could blame you for that versus I could hold you accountable for that.
Mm.
And these are two completely different things. And that doesn't mean that you haven't messed up the editing.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that there should not be justice. It's just that when we say you're canceled, we leave no room for any kind of reformation in society. Okay, that doesn't mean that justice won't be served. It just means that we need a dialogue also for reform. We need a space to take ownership. We need a space to take accountability. And when we go directly into cancel culture, which is just a straight out blame, cutting off, and for tossing you in the deep end, I think we also miss out on such important moments in society with what we could really be doing, the kind of dialogues we could really be having, the kind of accountability we could really be creating. And I know you're saying how to do that. So, like, to really break it down, I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, and not really. Not really sort of how do we do this? Because I think that question itself is really unfair, right? Okay, when somebody sort of raises a point, okay, hey, I think we don't do this well, we have this sort of reactionary catch up or kaise kare. So that's certainly not my question. I think it was.
Though, I mean, it's a valid question. I think about it all the time. I don't have the answers. I have fragments of answers that wouldn't do justice to anything, so I'm not going to say them. But I just think that the way that we are trying to work with some of it is not working, because we need more than blame and more than completely removing people from society, canceled, or just lifetime incarceration. We need some kind of reforms in society. We need a chance for some kind of bridge to happen where accountability can take place. And I don't think that when it comes to social media, I think that it has an inverse relationship with accountability.
Right. And so I'm curious if you could illustrate, either from something that has happened, or, from this example that we were using. Okay, oh well, Tooba, you haven't edited this video well. What would blame sound like, and what would accountability sound like?
Okay, well, let's run with your example of Tooba not editing it. It's a bit oversimplified, so maybe I can give you another one too. But blame would be like, Tooba, you messed up the video and it's terrible, and you're canceled. Okay? Whereas accountability would be like, Tooba, I'm really disappointed with this editing, and it's not what I was expecting. And I don't really know if I'm going to be comfortable working with you again. So it's a very subtle difference, because it's a simple example, but what it does is, when we blame people, they do not hold themselves accountable. When we hold people accountable, we create space for them to hold themselves accountable if they have that capacity.
Right.
So I think even when we cancel people, or, I think, I'll bring in one example, a bit slightly controversial, but, to do with this case, the lawyer who was hired to defend, I think the parents, was
Right.
getting bashed on social media. And I actually didn't speak up anywhere on social media, but I did raise my voice just at this one point where this is not about the lawyer. Everyone has the right to a fair and just trial, even a murder, even if the murderer is going to jail for life or they're getting the death penalty. It doesn't mean that we take away their rights, because we're looking at a whole system here. You know, we're not looking at targeting one person. And so I think what we saw was a lot of blame around that. How can you pick up a case like this? How can you? And I would say that's an example of what I'm calling cancel culture. Mm-hmm. I think that if the right questions were asked, and if we were to look at the ethics, if this was a concern, you know, I'm of the other view where everyone has the right to a fair defense, mm-hmm. but or, you know, a good lawyer, everyone has it. But let's say if we wanted to hold them accountable, we would ask them about the ethics behind it and ask them to represent and take accountability for their choices and cases. But I think the way that they were being canceled, it left no room for any understanding. It left no room for reflection. It left no room for any kind of dialogue to take place. And I'm not saying there would have been, but I just think sometimes when we're traumatized, our instincts are to make everything black and white, good and bad. And to make ourselves safe, we need to know what the bad is. Mm-hmm. And I think we get a heightened version of that on social media.
Right.
You know, it feels protective, and everything on social media, as we know from studies on bullying, and everything that happens on social media is more intensified. It's worse than real life. And a big part of that is because I'm removed. So I'm guarded. My vulnerability is here.
Yeah.
It's not human to human direct. We can all hold our vulnerabilities back. And what happens when we hold our vulnerabilities back? We can be quite brutal.
Mm. Which is kind of like, if you think about it, it's using the tools of the master, right? It's taking that same invulnerable, avenging or brutalizing mentality and just applying it to a different person. And I think that that's so often what we miss, because we have culturally, sometimes we sort of, you know, I've seen this in sort of like represented in media, where this idea is that there's this deep, dark part that all of us have that gains a sense of satisfaction, this kind of a Schadenfreude, or the sense of, you know, this person who did something terrible had something sort of doubly terrible happen to them. But if there is to really be sort of a revolution in the way that we relate to each other, then that revolution has to be a compassionate one.
Absolutely.
Like, we can't just be mean to a different set of people.
Absolutely. And I think, Tooba, there's a misconception where compassion or empathy or understanding or inquiring equates to not holding someone accountable, and that is completely untrue. When we hold ourselves and each other accountable, it is perhaps the most compassionate thing that we can do. It's the most vulnerable. It is the most honest. And I just think, since we're speaking about systems and we're speaking about the macro, we're not just speaking about here in Pakistan. Globally, we really struggle with this.
Yeah. So, in moments of this sort of collective trauma, because, you know, as we've both said, that there's sort of echoes of this that I think we're still sort of feeling, we're still hearing in our lives. It's going to stay with us for a long time in these small but I think significant ways, and hopefully some of them will be transformational, and some of them are going to push us to those defensive places, because that's how trauma impacts us, right? It's not just the impact of trauma itself is not sort of one dimensional. But I'm curious to hear what has helped you find some sense of grounding, and what might help people, in responding to a moment like this, whether that's just finding a sense of grounding or finding their own compassion, like we said, and also finding that compassion in their relationships.
Yeah. Could you ask me an easier question? Okay. Look, I think firstly, with what you first said, it's not one dimensional. It's impacted us in so many different ways. Yeah. And I think these kind of monumental traumas that become symbolic, they actually shift the fabric of society. And I can definitely say that that's what I'm seeing. That I'm seeing so much awareness. It's still coming in, not just in the therapy room, but around me. And this talk for women's rights, for the protection bill, for so many other, awful things that happen. I think it's shifting. Something is shifting. It might be subtle. It might not be everywhere. But for me, I feel it's that tiny bit of transformation is enormously huge. And I think we're living through that. So what we're actually seeing as a result of this trauma, or this one specific trauma, is we're going to be looking at generational effects to come. It's not just you and me. And when we study like how memory is handed down through the generations, we really see how trauma is handed down from events that we've never witnessed, but they've shaped families, people, society. And I think we're definitely in the midst of that in light of this case. What's helped me, I think, honestly, I really struggled. So I'll be honest. First week was awful. Other than, I'm not going to get into the basics of how to work with trauma. Mm-hmm. So other than doing trauma-based work with your therapist, other than that, what has helped me is seeing a little bit of the transformation, and being able to see where it's failing, but also where it's shifting, and being able to witness that. I think that's been hugely healing for me to some degree. And beyond that, I mean, this applies directly to me, so I can't speak for everyone, but I think working in a healing capacity is always healing for me, because working with same traumas that, sometimes it's your clients who are healing you. And as confusing as that sounds, I don't like to say that publicly much, but I know that you understand this, but it is definitely like I'm healing myself all the time through remarkable healing work that I have the privilege to witness other people doing. And it's just the transformation. So it's those little shifts. So it's the societal transformation. It's the shifts within people. And I think that's really helped me in this time. And yes, there is some disillusionment still with the systems and with the structures that we struggle with. So it's not all silver lining, but I just think transformation, because stagnation is what's really hard. And when we stagnate with trauma, and when we're in a loop with our trauma and we can't get out of it, which is a lot of what we do, like what you and I do in our everyday work, that's tough. So I think the transformational elements really helped me.
I think that makes a lot of sense. That's often my answer to, I'm sure you've been asked this question a lot of times. Well, aren't you depressed doing this work? And I'm like, no, it's the things that I have the privilege to witness, like watch people heal and watch people sort of transform and transcend. And I think I do really value and really resonate that in response to something like this, it wasn't sort of us adjusting our expectations to fit better, but really that sort of push for transformation, that something has to give, something has to change. Even if, and starting, even with that recognition that in mental health, the personal and the political are not separate. You can't have an oppressive society and have emotionally well-adjusted people. Those two things cannot coexist.
Absolutely. And I like to think of it like just like a family. If you have unhealthy parents, you cannot raise healthy kids. It's actually so straightforward. And I think we just need more and more awareness around this globally. I don't think, I don't like this idea that the West is any better and we're struggling. I think I see this everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think if we can start to see that in ourselves, okay, what are the ways in which I am classist, in which I am sexist, misogynistic, or homophobic, or whatever, then I feel like we can actually start doing the transformative work with ourselves.
Yeah. So I guess to hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah.
And be honest with ourselves, and that's often the hardest part.
Yeah. Jasmyn, thank you so much for taking out the time and dedicating not only the time, but the headspace and the emotional space to have this conversation with me.
Thank you so much, Tooba. This was lovely. And I love that you're doing this. I'm looking forward to having the whole series out.
Me too. Thank you.